Firstly, deciding to exit. Does the seller want to actually exit? What are their goals? What do they want to achieve? Why are they doing this?
Talking to a lot of content site owners where they just thought that the trajectory of their business was going to continue, as it had been prior to sort of late last year.
I've had conversations with sellers in the past where they feel like there's more growth in their business and they are like, okay, well, it's valued right here. Thanks for the valuation range. Let's check in again in a couple of months or 6 months.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Digital Dealmakers podcast. My name is Kristin Jacobsen, one of the co-hosts, and I've got Dominic Sullivan with me, who's the other co-host. And this is our first episode, and we're very excited to be here. It's taken us a little bit to get set up and get all the tech right, but we've finally made it. So really appreciate everyone that's tuning in for this first episode. We're very excited. And what we're going to do today is we're going to sort of give you an idea about why we've put this podcast together, who it's really for, and who we are. Because, there's a lot of podcasts out there of people, sort of talking about advice and what to do. But, really, it comes down to experience and expertise. And that's something that I truly believe myself and Dom have, and we'll be able to add a lot of value to you guys. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dominic Sullivan and tell you a little bit about him before he talks himself up. So Dom is an M&A specialist, and he's dealt with deals anywhere between 500,000 to 5 billion. I think it is the biggest deal that you've worked on for an M&A perspective. So, he's seen a lot in the M&A space, and I'm very excited that he decided to be a co-host for this podcast. But without further ado, Dom, would you like to sort of give yourself a bit of a wrap around what your experience and expertise is in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, the M&A world is a very diverse world with a lot of opportunity, especially over the last 5 to 10 years. And I've been fortunate enough to, I guess, ride the wave of that. I've started about 7 years ago, more in the turnaround and restructuring space in Sydney, Australia. I then kind of diversified away from turnaround and restructuring into more financial due diligence and transaction services of the M&A deals. So really focusing from the accounting and financial side of things. I then moved through to working at a scale-up company and working in the internal M&A corporate development team there, where I was part of a team which acquired both public and private companies. And then, I went back to, let's say, my true entrepreneurial passion, where, I could leverage off my M&A experience and then also, work with hungry entrepreneurs and help them exit in the best way possible to sophisticated buyers. So yeah, that's been a bit of my journey. I am super excited to kind of start this series with Kristin. We really hope that our listeners and our audience can get something tangible out of this. Every episode, if everyone can take 3 key takeaways out of the session, it would put a huge smile on my face, and Kristin as well. So yeah, this is our first episode, so we're hungry, we're ready to go. We want you guys to get something out of it, and feedback is always welcome. But I won't say anything more about myself. Over to you, Kristin.
Yeah, so I mean, what Dom just said, in terms of why we put this podcast together, we really want to be able to provide people that own online businesses that might look to actually sell the business, or people that want to buy an online business, and really provide them with practical tips, insights, strategies, and real life success stories of people that have actually ended up buying and selling an online business successfully, and really get their perspective as well. So we're going to have guests on the show as well. And, with having Dom on this podcast as a co-host, he's got a wealth of knowledge in this space. Me personally, so I'm an exit advisor for online business owners. So I help people go through the process of actually selling their online business. And I've personally went through that process myself before joining this industry. So I built an online business up to a six-figure exit, and I exited the week before the whole COVID lockdown happened in 2020. And so, it was perfect timing, right? But, really through that process and my background in finance, really understand how the process works and, what some of the challenges are for those that are looking to sell their online business. So, we're definitely going to dive into that a little bit more in this episode. We're going to cover the path to exit. So we're really going to talk about, what are the fundamental steps that is in the process, and also, what things that you need to sort of look out for or consider if you are looking to sell your online business. So let's kick that off. Dom, do you want to start with sort of giving an overview of like the path to exit and what that sort of looks like?
Yeah. I mean, I think first it's important to say that, this episode is dedicated to a brief overview of what the M&A process looks like, right? So if you're sitting at home or cooking at home or riding a bike on your way to work or wherever you are right now, you can imagine that it's probably hard to fully grasp each and every step. So this is going to be a high level overview, but what we're going to do is at the end of the session, in the podcast notes, we're going to have a link to a free webinar, basically, where I'll host it and I'll share some slides and go into the details that I'm talking about, in this episode. I think also, Kristin, before we get into it, again, the purpose of this podcast is obviously to learn something and get out of it. Our target audience, we're not sure who our target audience is going to be yet. It's going to be based on the feedback that we have, of course. But in the beginning, it's really going to be targeted at, someone who has never sold an online business before, doesn't know the process and breaking it down. Of course, over time, we can go into more, difficult topics, based on your feedback. I mean, this is we want to build a community here, an accessible, relaxed community where everyone can ask questions and those questions can be addressed in a practical manner. And I think, again, later episodes in the series, we're going to have buyers on the podcast. We're going to have previous sellers on the podcast. We're going to learn from them. We're going to learn from people that have actually gone through the process, but also the emotional roller coaster that it entails. And I think that's really fun as well. I guess moving on to the first episode and covering the path to exit. I think to really break it down, I think whether you're selling a business worth 50,000 or $5 billion, it's pretty much the same structure and same processes. Now, of course, some are more complex than others, right? But the process is typically the same. And I think, what I like to break it down into is kind of 8 steps. Now, maybe some people are rolling their eyes thinking, okay, that's a lot of steps. But of course, some of these steps happen faster than others. But for me, I can really simplify it in those 8 steps. So for me, it is, the way I see it and the way I deal with my clients is firstly deciding to exit. Does the seller want to actually exit? What are their goals? What do they want to achieve? Why are they doing this? Once, you've decided to exit, obviously in that conversation, we agree on your best situation in terms of a deal structure. We organize your key documents. We validate your EBITDA. We validate your revenue. We also fully understand your business model and what the key attractive elements of your business are. And of course, as I said, we agree and define on a valuation range that we would go to market with. So once we've got all our ducks in a row and really aligned as a team, as an advisor and a seller, we then move forward through to deal live. And that's when we actually go to market. And
that's when the business is actually for sale.
Yeah, exactly. So that's when there's no turning back. Or no, of course there is always. You never have to sell, of course. But that's when you actually go live and you reach out to your advisor and you perhaps as the seller, reach out to potential sellers, potential interested parties that might be interested in acquiring your business. So, I mean, those first two steps, it's so key that you're aligned with your advisor, and making sure that your advisor knows what you want and your advisor isn't taking full control. I really like to have a team-based mentality, with the sellers I work with, and that's also the nature that we have at Flipper as well. But I mean, Kristin, from your experience, mate, you've actually sold your own business, unlike myself, who has kind of always just been on the fence. What I've always found that people underestimate the emotion behind deciding to sell. I think, when I've worked on, as I said, public companies, private companies, worked with, very world-renowned CFOs or, strong financial functions, CEOs, etc. Of course, they care about the deal, but they're a little more detached from the deal from an emotional perspective. So I'm just super curious, Kristin, when you're working with sellers in the beginning, and yourself, like what type of emotions do you find what were the answers what were the questions and the answers you had when you wanted to sell?
Yeah, it's a very good point. So, I mean, the absolute first point of like actually selling an online business is actually deciding to, right? So, a lot of people have different reasons to sell their online business. Me personally, I decided to sell my online business because, I saw that there was a lot of like more compliance and like more regulation coming into the industry. And there was a pretty bumpy road for the industry ahead. And, honestly, I built the business over a 6-year period, and I sort of got tired of the industry. So I really wanted to, sort of move on to a different venture, right? So, for me, it was partially a personal decision to, sort of change things up in my life, but also, seeing the writing on the wall and seeing the, potential risk of like, losing value of a business that I built over time, right? So, for a lot of people that I speak to that are, considering their online business, some of the main factors of why they actually decide, I mean, obviously, money or what you get for the business is an important factor. But underlying that, it's either because, you want to free up resources and time to focus on a new project or a new venture. Or sometimes for businesses that are growing to a certain point, they've hit a glass ceiling in that sense. So in order to really, go to the next level or grow the business, there's a lot more expertise, capital risk that's associated with that. So rather than actually doing that, they decide to capitalize on what they built to that point and pass it on to an acquirer that does have the skill and the capital to be able to actually grow the business, right? For some people, it's just a lifestyle change. They want to, spend a bit more time with other things, like with their kids, or they want to take a sabbatical or something like that. So, fundamentally, the most important point is really understanding why you want to sell the business, right? So that's for more of a individual, sole owner based sort of business. But if you go to the bigger end of businesses, yeah, there's money involved, but underlying that, there's a goal or something that they're looking to achieve, right?
Yeah.
So really understanding that first and sort of navigating that point first is the most important, because even if you're going and trying to sell the business yourself or you're working with a team of experts, it is not an easy process, right? So you've really got to commit to it. So, really finding the underlying reason first is most important. And then I think you alluded to, really understanding, what the business is worth, like what the actual realistic valuation and sale price could be, because, that's obviously an important factor as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think a common question that I get asked as well is, okay, Dom, when is the best time to sell? And it's so interesting now. Okay, let's say I think since I joined Flipper, maybe I've closed now, let's say around 40 deals, right? And it's really interesting to see the first conversations that you have with those sellers, the timing of when they're deciding to sell in terms of where their business is at its maturity and how fast it sells. I've had conversations with sellers in the past where they feel like there's more growth in their business and they are like, okay, well, it's valued right here. Thanks for the valuation range. Let's check in again in a couple of months or 6 months or whatever. And then you have other sellers who are then in a position where they need to sell. They're plateauing or even declining, and the amount of buyers on the table just shrinks, significantly. So I think, if you're asking yourself the question, when is the best time to sell? I think it's important to recognize what buyers want. And, if you're buying a business, you want to make sure that there's some upside for you. And I think it's really important as a seller to not always have the view that I'm going to sell when I'm at my biggest. Maybe it's good to sell as you're growing. When there's something in it for the buyer, you can take some money off the table and you can explore different deal structures, whether it be an earnout or keeping some equity in the business and leveraging off the scale and expertise of some of the incredible buyers that are part of the Flipper network. As we know, experts that can leverage off their capital, that work for private equity, or roll-ups who have centralized functions that can use those centralized functions to scale and their experience. So I think that's also something really important to keep in mind, when you're deciding to sell, and it's a common question that we get. But ultimately, it's the seller's decision. And we'll cover, by the way, I mentioned deal structures. We'll cover that more in the webinar in a more detailed session. Because again, there's 8 steps. We're only at steps 1 and 2. Which were, by the way, the seller decides to exit and the deal then gets live. So basically what happens after that? So the goal then after that, for me, it's getting a letter of intent. So a letter of intent, or an LOI as it's known, it means a buyer goes to you and goes, look, hey, I've reviewed your IM, your investment memorandum, which is a document that your advisor will write for you. I've reviewed the information. I've reviewed your profit and loss. I've reviewed your forecasts. I've reviewed your historic financials. I've reviewed your business, your product. I've had a demo. Actually, I would like to make an offer. Now, it's a non-binding offer, so that's really important for sellers to know. It's not a commitment. It's saying, having seen what I've seen so far, I'm interested. I want to submit a non-binding offer. Now, the key clauses within that are usually, of course, the deal structure that's defined, which will go on in detail in the webinar on the different types of deal structures and the benefits of each. But also, they like to define the DD period, which is really important, and also have in the LOI exclusivity. So exclusivity is basically saying, hey, is the buyer saying, look, I'm going to invest time and resources into looking into your business further. I want to make sure that you're not going to talk to any other buyers while I'm doing so.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. It's got to be something in it for them, right? Like they're investing time and energy into potentially buying your business. So,
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important as a seller to also recognize that, the buyer is going to put time and effort into me. I'm also going to put time and effort into them. I'm going to have an opportunity cost of talking to other buyers. So this better be the one,
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's important as well.
One thing I thought of when you were, sort of talking about that particular point, like to even get to a point of an LOI or of a letter of intent, you actually got to have something to provide a potential buyer
No, of
to
course.
want to make
Yeah.
the LOI, right?
Yeah.
And
So, oh yeah, sorry, you
be
go.
able to actually find a buyer to
Yeah.
begin with,
So
right?
yeah,
So
so
yeah,
on the list and on the diagram that I have, right, it's step one, seller decides to exit. Step two, the deal goes live, and then after that, the first goal is to get that LOI submitted, which is step five. But steps three and four leading up to that goal are indeed, Kristin, as you said, circulating an investment memorandum, having one-to-one meetings with potential interested parties. It's also providing access to a limited, virtual data room, and staggering that information that you provide. So, what does that look like in reality? You go live, you go to market, you have people inquire, and you say, "Hey, Dominic," or "Hey, seller, I like what I see so far. Do you have any further information that you can provide me?" They usually review the information. They'll then go, "Okay, this kind of looks interesting. Are you up for a meeting?" Now, the way I like to do it is I really prioritize the time of my seller. So I really make sure that I vet the buyer. I understand the reasons why they're interested. I understand what their level of financing is or financial position, if they're a cash buyer or a finance, like they need to rely on financing. I want to understand their high level valuation. Of course, the buyer will never reveal their cards. I mean, I used to be a buy side advisor, so I also know you're not going to show your cards at that early stage, but you just want to make sure that you're not wasting the time of the seller, and also the buyer isn't wasting his or her time either. So in those one-to-one meetings, you kind of get to know each other a little bit, let's say like a first date. And then after that, you then decide if you want to progress or not. And that's when you lead to step four, which is providing limited VDR access of documents to those that qualify for the next round. So that's often a really interesting point, because that's when usually the buyer has a better understanding of the financials and of the trends, and of the tech, or the quality of the product at that point. So that's step four, and then as I said, after that we then have step five, which is the letter of intent, which is submitted, and that's the first goal. That's the first, let's say, mini win that you can get. There's still a lot to go through after that, but if you can get an LOI submitted, you kind of have a line in the sand, someone committed saying, "Hey, I want to take this to the next level," and it can be really exciting. Now, Kristin, I can imagine, like, what was the process with you when you sold? Did you receive one LOI? Did you receive a couple of LOIs? Did you use that LOI to leverage it against another bidder? Because we can always be creative, right, in our competitive marketplace that we're on. So how did it go with you?
Yeah, so I had I set up the agreement with the licensee that I had at the time that there was a guarantee that they'll buy my business at a certain multiple, right?
Okay.
So I already had like a guaranteed buyer, but I also had the option to sell the business to someone in the same a company in the same network. So before I sort of hit that guarantee button, I wanted to see if I could actually get a better offer. But I mean, really, it just wasn't possible. But one thing, looking back at it now, I thought it was kind of a relatively easy process to selling a business that it humble sort of multiple six-figure business. But the reality was, it's not, right? So even if I had my time again, I would definitely be sort of leveraging an expert or M&A advisor in specifically in that industry. That's where I made the mistake. But in terms of the letter of intent, it was already sort of guaranteed. But
Okay.
what the biggest challenge was,
that's kind of chill.
yeah, that was good. But the
Yeah.
due diligence process was like a David versus
A
Goliath
nightmare.
situation, right? So,
Yeah.
the guarantee was a very good, very attractive, buyback sort of arrangement. So good, in fact, that they realized that moving forward, this is definitely not viable for us. So, the company that I ended up selling it to was looking for all kinds of ways to reduce the amount that they were going to pay. And so, I had to learn very quickly around like contract law, what was effectively legal or not legal for them to do in terms of an agreement. So I mean, that was honestly, that was the hardest thing that I've had to ever do in business. And that's because it was like me versus one of the largest finance companies in Australia and their whole legal and due diligence team versus me, right? I mean, that's why if people are looking to
Manchester City versus Luton Town or Derby County
I'll
or
take your
something
word
like
for it.
Hopefully there's no Derby County supporters listening, but
maybe like we just lost a few, but so I mean, at the end of the day, like it's really, that's why when I'm talking to people that are looking to sell their online business, like it is tempting to try and do it yourself. And because I don't know, sometimes they probably think that it's like almost like selling a house or selling a car or something like that. But I mean, it's just not like that, right? So you really got to know what you're doing. And if you're coming up against someone who's got the experience in buying a business, that can be dangerous in terms of what you're going to get out of it. So
for sure. I mean, look, my style is honestly, if I will communicate the value that I can bring and make them aware of red flags during the process. But if a seller ultimately thinks that they can do it themselves, to be honest, I'm not going to try and convince them any further, because from my side, like, I want to work with people who want the advice and will, of course, I'm not saying I say, jump and they say how high on every topic, but, you really want to, add value with people that want to get the most out of their situation. So I think, there's been many occasions where, I've had calls, people have, decided to try and do it themselves to save money. And sometimes, they come back and then want to work together. And other times, actually they do go well. I do think, if I was ever selling a business, I really think, hire expertise when you can. It definitely saves money in the long run. You will get more for your business. The process will be smoother, providing the advisor knows what they're doing. I think that's for me. It's just a no-brainer, really. But you did allude to your process, right? The due diligence phase, which was where I also call it the grey hair phase, where it's just it can be a real slog. And for those that don't know, so after the letter of intent is submitted, the non-binding offer, you then go through a due diligence phase. And that due diligence phase is where the buyer sees pretty much everything. You open the Komodo, you show everything of the business, and you essentially have to, provide the questions and answers. Now, that's typically done in 3 kind of work streams. There are more, but I'm typically, with selling SaaS businesses, mobile apps, e-commerce, content businesses, it's typically in kind of 3 streams. The first is financial due diligence. The second is product or IT tech due diligence, and the third is legal due diligence. So essentially, financial due diligence, to simplify it, the buyer just wants to make sure that your P&L that you've provided matches the tax returns that you submit and the bank statements. They want to make sure that there's no funny business going on. They want to make sure that, if you're saying you have 2 million ARR as a SaaS company, that it's indeed 2 million. If you're saying that your expenses are, $50K a month in marketing, or, $13,000 a month in TikTok ads, well, they want to see it. They want to see the proof. So as you can imagine, it's a big decision to buy a business, and they want to ensure that they go through that process, which is why it's so important to have those deliverables ready. We will talk about that in the webinar, like the key deliverables, ensuring you get your hygiene in check, the checklist that you should have ready. Obviously, we won't go into it now because this is more of a listening exercise rather than a visual presentation. But obviously, really important. Now, tech DD, what does that look like? Or IT due diligence? It's the review of your source code, or it's the review of your product in detail. It's making sure that the buyer wants to make sure that if they buy your business, of course, that there might be a transition period. But are they comfortable with running it forward? Is the quality of the tech good? And are there any fundamental issues with it? And then, of course, there's legal DD, and that's where you'll have the buyer, whether they outsource it, they'll look at your business from a legal perspective and how it will impact them from a legal perspective, but also analyze key contracts and clauses with your customers or suppliers or relationships that are really critical to the business. So once that due diligence, aka grey hair phase, is completed, in parallel, typically what I like to do is I also like to draft the purchase agreement, the APA or the SPA. Step 7, executing the APA or SPA. Now, APA means asset purchase agreement. SPA means share purchase agreement. Essentially, an asset purchase agreement is where the buyer decides to cherry pick some of the assets of your business, and they don't want to acquire your entity, your BV or your LLC or your limited company. They just want to acquire the key assets of your business. And the reason why they want to do that typically, right, is because they don't want to assume the liabilities of your company. Because if a buyer wants to buy your entity, they are then also liable for liabilities potentially. So often the buyer will often want to sign an APA, will prepare an APA, because they want to just cherry pick those assets. Now, we will go into a deeper dive, of course, into an APA versus an SPA in the webinar. But again, trying to keep it high level. We don't want to bore you too much. Not that it's boring, but you get my drift. So it's important to know that. Now, what exactly is an APA or SPA fundamentally in simple, normal human terms? It's literally the buyer going, hey, 2 months ago or 6 weeks ago or 1 month ago, I proposed, or no, didn't propose, but I said, I like your business. I want to offer this amount of money, non-binding, subject to DD. I've done all this DD. I've done a thorough check in X, Y, and Z. And hey, let's go. Let's move forward. And that's when you sign the binding offer. There's no more changing after that most of the time, unless the contract says it is, but 99% of the time not. And then what does that look like? So you're agreeing to the deal terms, the valuation, you're then agreeing on dates. So what are those dates? Those dates relate to the deal closing and settlement. And that's step 8. And on deal closing, that's when Kristin and I will take you out for a fun lunch or dinner, and we celebrate. And basically, that is when the business transfers from the owner or the seller to the buyer. So what does that process look like in an online world? Essentially, what happens is the buyer transfers the money to a third-party trust account, like an escrow account. Once that money hits, we then check that the money's hit, and then we advise the buyer and say, hey, it's now safe to transfer those assets to the buyer. The buyer then receives those assets, and the buyer will then say, hey, everything has been transferred. The money can now be released. And that's basically the process. Now, Of course, after the deal, there are many other elements, right? There's integration efforts, there's transition periods, there's, depending on the deal structure, you might have a seller financing deal structure, you might have an earn-out. There are other common deal structures that you can agree to, which again, we'll look into during the webinar. But basically, that's the process. So the 8 steps. So step 1, let's see if you can remember. No, just joking. Step 1 is seller decides to exit. Step 2 is getting the deal live. Step 3 is circulating the investment memo and having those one-on-one meetings to really vet the interested parties. Step 4 is providing a bit of extra information through a virtual data room. Step 5 is when you receive the proposal or the LOI, right? A non-binding offer. Step 6 is the engagement period. No, it is the due diligence phase, where basically the buyer is looking at your business in terms of financial due diligence, legal due diligence, product due diligence. Step 7 is executing the APA and the SPA, which is when it is the legal document where you are now in binding. You're getting, it's the final whistle. And then step 8 is then deal closing, transfer, settlement.
Absolutely. So I mean, that it sounds like, I mean, we really like simplified this process in this episode, right?
Of course, yeah. Well, I think, of course, we have, right? But I think it's important for, it to be bite-sized for our listeners. And, by the way, everyone, we're open to feedback. So if you say more detail, Dom, or more detail, Kristin, we can tailor the sessions and the series according to that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, we're building this community, this accessible community where people can, have, learn from our lessons learned, learn from when we interview buyers, interview sellers, learn from their lessons learned. We really want this to be engaging. But I guess, mate, I'm interrupting. You wanted to say something?
I was going to say, like, so fundamentally, like, whether it's a $10,000 business or a $5 million business, effectively, those steps are the steps. And the increasing in the price, the more complex each of those steps are, more nuanced those steps are. But it is one of these things that, like, I think a lot of online business owners that do want to sell their online business don't actually really realize like what it takes to sell an online business. And so, leveraging off some sort of platform or, using a specialist broker in that sense to do that is fundamentally important if you do value your time and want to get the most out of it effectively, because you could do it yourself, but at the end of the day, you're actually going to spend more time, energy, and effort, and potentially lose out rather than actually using an expert. So you can definitely use platforms to be able to help you through the process, but fundamentally, a lot of those platforms you have to go through those steps yourself. So going back to the initial first step of like, okay, what is the motivation? What is the goal of actually selling? That's fundamentally got to come first, because it is a process for sure. We're not going to sugarcoat it, right? Even for the professionals like Dom, it can be a challenge. So
of course, and I think also you don't know what you're getting. M&A is like a box of chocolates. Like, you just don't know which one you're going to get. I mean, you literally have deals where it's such a smooth process. Often it's because the sellers are very organized. They have their deliverables in order. They've prepared well. And then you get other situations where it's a roller coaster.
What's a P&L? I don't have one.
Yeah, exactly. So, I do think that the process, although can be stressful, it's so awesome to get the result right. Like, there's nothing better than getting the call from the seller after X amount of money just hit my account. I get so much satisfaction out of that. And I think that, it's worth having an advisor to take you through that process. I mean, yeah, it's an investment, but it's also just making your time, like it's also making the most of your time as well. It's an investment in the sense that, you have expertise from someone that's been through it many times before, but it's also saving your time and allowing you to run your business. Because that's another thing. Yeah, I don't want to go over time, but you also got to make sure that during that exit process, you're keeping your eye on the ball with your business. I often
Yeah. Yeah.
sometimes see sellers think, I'm selling it in 3 months anyway. Yeah, I'm not going to spend the same amount on my marketing. Well, okay,
Or
that's going to
forget to
impact
order
your
stock.
that's going to impact your revenue, which is going to impact your bottom line, which obviously, if you apply a multiple to that, gonna affect the end enterprise value and sale price. So there's also that element as well. But I think that's probably the end of that session. I think every week we're going to have a podcast in the series. We also will bring, we'll also have other people, different voices, so you don't get bored from us yapping around all the time. But Kristin, I think mate, I know you love some content, and you love listening to or reading different newsletters or listening to different podcasts. So for you, mate, what was your favorite podcast of the week that you'd like to share?
Favorite podcast of the week. I would say it was really a podcast around, how things change very rapidly in this particular space, right? I forgot the name of the podcast host, but I'll tag him in after we publish the episode. But effectively, it was going into the whole space of online content businesses, right? So they've those guys have really faced a lot of challenges with the Google algorithm updates. There's a lot of sort of guessing and wondering, what Google's doing, but he touches on a point around how, which is something that I experienced myself, talking to a lot of content site owners, where they just thought that the trajectory of their business was going to continue, as it had been prior to sort of late last year, right? And so it's really an interesting podcast episode, because it sort of talks about fundamentally things in this space can change very rapidly. So holding off on like wanting to sell on the basis that things are just going to continue as they have been, that is a very big risk to take. And
Sure.
Unfortunately, a lot of content site owners, did lose out a lot in the last, sort of 6 to 12 months because of those changes. And they sort of talk about like the rapid change of AI as well, and how that's impacting online businesses. So, but I forgot the name of the podcast episode, so I'll get them tagged in. What about you, Dom? I know that you love a
worries,
good
mate.
read.
Yeah, no worries, mate. I'm sure we'll list it for everyone to look at the end. For me, I'm a fan of a guy called Dirk Samler. I hope I pronounced his name right. He does a nice SaaS newsletter, and this week, or it was last week, but I read it this week. He did a good newsletter on SaaS valuation myths, and he goes through each of the different ways of valuing a SaaS business, and I should actually say who he is. He works in the M&A team at an acquirer of SaaS businesses, and he gives some really good insights. Also, he posts some good memes on LinkedIn as well, which I laugh at every now and then. But he writes some really good stuff. So I'll also link that article because it kind of covers many of the SaaS valuation myths out there, and provides some really fair and reasonable insights. It's also quite digestible as well, not too technical, in a good way.
All right. Well, we got
But
a few little goodies for you guys. So, Dom's going to sort of, if you like to get into more of the detail and the more of an intimate understanding about, how the process works from start to finish, because you might be, already in that process or seriously considering it and really want to, be prepared for what to expect in that process, then Dom's going to go into that in a bit more detail. If we did that today, it'd be a 4-hour podcast. But what I'd ask you guys to do is really, we really want to get your feedback. So share what your takeaways were from this podcast episode. Let us know, what you'd like to hear from us moving forward. We're always open to covering those points because we're really, we're doing this podcast for you guys. So, what you guys want to hear about, you've got Dom who, should be charging about $500 an hour for this sort of advice, maybe even more.
That is ridiculous, but
but well, some M&A advisors do charge that. So, but you get to find out specifics around this. And one of the next episodes that we're going to do is actually going to be from the seller's perspective, like from somebody who has started an online business from scratch, built it up to just over 6 figures, what his experience was, why he decided to sell it. So you can see it from, the direct eyes of what that process looks like, and what happens after that. He's doing some very exciting things since he's sold his first online business. But any other things that you want to say before we wrap up here, Dom?
Oh, I think, well, firstly, thank you for everyone for joining in. Like, I understand there's many podcasts out there, just another podcast, but thank you for listening. I think 3 key things from my side. So firstly, feedback. As Kristin said, this is for you. We want to build an accessible community for, education in this space. So please provide us with some topics of interest, something that you'd like us to focus on, episode suggestions. We're open to it. So we're doing this for you. The second thing from my side is there will be this webinar. So please, if you're interested in the webinar, it will be what we just covered, but in more detail, essentially. So we'll have a link in the show notes, in the podcast notes for you to join. And thirdly, if you have questions that you want us to address in the next episode, we'll have a question segment. So, if you have any prickly questions, difficult ones, come at us. It will make it interesting and spicy.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. So again, thank you, everyone. Looking forward to the next pod. And have a really good rest of your week.
All right. Thanks for tuning in, guys. See you next time.